How soon can the Falcons become Super Bowl contenders?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for a lifetime, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. You may know me as Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this pod, which means you make it your first listen or first watch each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is a mailbag episode where we got a bunch of listener questions from our favorite everydayers, the Locked On Falcons insiders who get priority. If you want to get priority on future mailbags and whatnot, hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You'll get access also to the film breakdowns that I've done of every single Falcons draft pick. Just dropped Zion Logue this past Thursday, and we'll be diving into NFL film very shortly. So go check that out. You get that 14-day free trial, so you can check that out for free and then pay $4.99 a month after that point. But we got a lot of great questions from them, including on whether or not Kaden Ellis could be playing more outside linebacker than inside linebacker this year. You know, why I don't necessarily base my opinions on players based off of where they were picked. But first, we're going to talk about the Falcons' potential Super Bowl window. Well, all right, we'll hear this from Jeremy. He says, I know we aren't a Super Bowl team now, but what do we need to get there? As in, we just need one piece or multiple? And also, what's the time frame to becoming contenders? 1 year, 2? Then Kirk might be gone then. So, Jeremy, my quick and dirty formula for who is a Super Bowl contender is basically based off of two things, right? Do you have an explosive offense, and are you able to pressure the quarterback? And if you check those two boxes, again, it's not just those are the only two boxes, but those are the two biggest boxes that I think you need to be checked in order to be a Super Bowl team. Pressuring the quarterback matters because, you know, there's a high probability that when we get to January, you're going to face some high-level quarterbacks, and the only way you can really slow those guys down is by pressuring them, especially since you're not expecting to get elite quarterback play from your quarterback here in Atlanta and Kirk Cousins or Michael Penix in the future. And again, maybe I'm wrong in that assessment, but you're not really expecting that sort of top 3, top 5 caliber elite quarterback play. You're expecting maybe upper-tier quarterback play, maybe that top 8, top 12 sort of quarterback. You know, that's where Matt Ryan lived throughout his career. Matt Stafford has lived throughout his career. Eli Manning was in that range. Joe Flacco was in that range. And that's basically the guys that, you know, will black out in the month of January and black out and wake up and find a Lombardi trophy in their hand. And they're like, what happened? I blacked out for a month. And it's like, yeah, you threw 12 touchdowns and 0 interceptions in that month. And they're like, oh, I didn't realize. Flacco being a great example of that, Eli doing that twice. And those are the types of quarterbacks that you can't really expect, like the elite quarterback, the Mahomes, the Josh Allen, the Aaron Rodgers. You're kind of expecting those guys to do that every single year that they get in the postseason. Now, they don't do that every year, but you're expecting it to. The other guys that we're talking about, the Ryans, the Elis, et cetera, they might do that like 2 or 3 times at most in their NFL career. And that's really what you're hoping for Kirk Cousins and probably what you're hoping for Michael Penix. And, you know, because you may be facing an Aaron Rodgers, a Patrick Mahomes in January, you know, pressure is what's going to be able to bring those elite quarterbacks down to the level of your Kirk Cousins, your Michael Penix, your Joe Flacco, your Matt Stafford, et cetera. So coupling that with, you know, not having elite quarterback play, it also means, you know, you're going to need your supporting cast to step up a little bit more than, say, a Patrick Mahomes needs to have his supporting cast step up. And so you need Bijan and Drake and Kyle Pitts to be those explosive playmakers and among the more explosive playmakers at their respective positions. You need your offensive line to be better here in Atlanta. And despite all the websites and analysts that, you know, indicate that the Falcons have a top 5 offensive line, like, they need to show that they're worthy of those rankings by basically not needing play action passing to mask their inefficiencies in pass protection, because there's a good chance that you're going to be facing a team in January that has an elite pass rush and has an elite quarterback, and you're going to have to get into a shootout and you're going to have to throw the ball 40, 45 times in that game. And if your offensive line can't hold up against those pass rushes, and you basically we need to use the play action as Arthur Smith has regularly used these last couple of years to mask the Falcons' deficiencies in pass protection. Like, that's not a formula for success. So we need to see if this offensive line under Zach Robinson and company can do that. So, there's a lot of boxes that the Falcons are going to have to check for. I can answer you whether they're one piece or multiple pieces away. And in theory, on offense, at least, if Kirk Cousins is that top 8-ish quarterback, if their big three at the skill position players are, those impactful, explosive playmakers that we all think they're capable of being, if the offensive line steps up, is Zach Robinson is the type of play caller that is good at designing explosive plays rather than, the type of play caller that Sark and Cutter and Arthur Smith were, which that wasn't a strength of their game. They were okay at that, but it wasn't something that they were going to add. It's going to be really hard for the Falcons to be a Super Bowl contender without checking all those boxes. But in theory, if they check all those boxes, I think, you have a potential Super Bowl caliber offense as early as 2025. And I say 2025 rather than 2024 is mostly because in theory, year 2 of your offense is going to be better than year 1 of your offense. Now you have all these pieces. Kirk Cousins will be a year removed from the Achilles. We know that it takes the better part of 2 years for players to recover from that before they get back to their previous form, all that and more. So, and then in theory, Michael Penix could theoretically build off of that in 2026 and 2027. So in theory, and I keep stressing the word in theory because, success for the Atlanta Falcons is always theoretical, not realistic. But, that's what I've learned of being a Falcon fan for 30 years. But, in theory, you could have a Super Bowl window for your offense in the next 3 to 4 years. Whether the defense is on that timeline, I think that remains to be seen. I'm a little more doubtful, especially when we're talking about the pass rush. Like, it feels like your pass rush is probably at least 3 years away. So again, that's part of that window. Maybe the back end when Penix takes over, maybe you'll have a pass rush at that point in time. We'll see. But there's also a reality where the Falcons are, pulling in Les Snead and going F them picks and trading for Micah Parsons next year. So, that might fast forward that timeline. So we'll see how that breaks down. But basically, to answer your question, Jeremy, I think there are multiple pieces away. But again, a lot of that depends on how many of those boxes that we're talking about on offense and defense that they're able to check this year. And then we can go like, oh, they're only actually 3 pieces away as opposed to the 7 pieces away or whatever it is. So we'll see how that goes. And our next question is a concept I've briefly discussed on the pod before, because I've mentioned before that I don't judge players based off of where they were drafted, which is not a particularly common perspective. And one of our listeners wants me to explain why I don't think it's about the picks, but it's all about the players. And we'll do that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, it is summertime, which means baseball is king. And it means the Braves are getting back in their grooves. And if it's time to get back in the ballpark, and Game Time is here to help you do so. And Game Time is helping you in so many ways. You can shop their flash deals, which mean you can save on exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. Their all-in prices means what you see is what you get. So you won't get hit by hidden fees at checkout. And what you see is what you get is what we love about Game Time, because everybody loves the views from your seat. So you can pick that perfect spot to catch a foul ball before you head down to the ballpark, whether you're into baseball, other sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you. Game Time is taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Guys, I want to tell you about Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you each and every day to bring the big stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, and part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So our next question comes from Eddie R., another Locked On Falcons insider. He says, I've heard you say before that you really don't judge players based on their draft position once they are on the team. That is something I've always done as a fan. I'd be interested to hear more about why you don't do that. I think it's probably the right approach, but Terry Fontenot's choices in the first round so far make it difficult. Everything in me says, based on where they drafted, if we're not seriously having conversations about who's better between Kyle Pitts and Travis Kelce by the end of his rookie contract, then picking him at 4 was a whiff. Same thing if London and Robinson aren't top 5 at their positions, respectively. I know that those expectations may not be, it may be unrealistic, but that's my knee-jerk reaction based on where they were drafted. So I guess what I'm asking is your philosophy that their production relative to draft position is irrelevant if they contribute to a winning product. The simple answer is yes. That's generally my philosophy. I look at you from a perspective as, do you help me win football games? Then I don't really care where you were drafted. I don't think the big reason is for that because I don't think draft position is a good predictor of NFL success. Nothing really is a good predictor of NFL success when it comes to the NFL draft. It's why, say it with me, the draft is a crapshoot. But I also think judging players based off of draft position is a pretty arbitrary exercise. Now, the longer answer is, I think the goal is to win football games, right? A draft pick has never won or lost a football game. Now, plenty of players have won and lost football games, but a draft pick doesn't do it. Your ability to win football games is based off of your ability to match up. And when I say match up, simply, your ability to neutralize your opponent's strengths while exploiting their weaknesses and your ability to stop them from trying to do the same thing to you. So, for example, in week 1, we faced the Steelers. Like, one of the Steelers' strengths is their pass rush, right? That's headlined by TJ Watt, and the Falcons need to neutralize that. And going back to the earlier point about the Falcons' offensive line's weakness, relatively speaking, being pass protecting, again, they're not the worst pass protecting offensive line in the league, but that is going to be a challenge for this offensive line, right? Now, the strength of this offensive line is run blocking, right? And that is perfectly embodied in one particular player, which is Kaleb McGary, who's a very good run blocker, but very questionable in pass protection, especially when he's matched up against speed. Now, TJ Watt brings more than just speed to the table. He's a complete pass rusher, which is why he's a future Hall of Famer. But, he certainly has more than enough speed to give Kaleb McGary problems in that game. And now you're probably sitting here going, okay, what does that have to do with this question? Well, basically, I don't necessarily judge Kaleb McGary or really anybody else based off of whether or not they're worth the pick, right? A draft, as I said, a draft pick isn't blocking TJ Watt. Now, a player might. Now, and I say might because very few players are actually blocking TJ Watt. So a player might block him. But, the picks are essentially inconsequential. Once they are used, they're meaningless. It's all really about the player from that point of time. And so when we ask the question, is Kaleb McGary worth the pick, right? PFF did a recent breakdown, calling him the best player, looking at each player, each first round pick and looking at the best player picked at those spots since 2015. And McGary was by far the best pick at pick 31. So that would arguably say he's worth the pick. You can also look at whether or not he was worth trading up for, which a lot of people were critical of when the Falcons did that, right? But if you look at the 6 offensive tackles that I think went in round 2 after Kaleb McGary, he's better than all of those. Like, the one that you might put on a similar level with Kaleb McGary is Jawan Taylor, right? But he's just as flawed, if not more flawed than Kaleb McGary. He's a better pass protector than run blocker, but he also is a penalty machine because he's had as many penalties in his last 8 games as Kaleb McGary's had in his last 3 years combined. So, like, when I look at that and I say, like, if the Falcons hadn't traded up for Kaleb McGary, they would have had much worse right tackle play over the last, 5 years than they probably did. So, again, it probably means that Kaleb McGary's worth it. So, I think objectively speaking, Kaleb McGary's worth the pick. Now, I'm sure plenty of people disagree with that, but that to me is where the arbitrariness of it comes, because what is being worth the pick, right? That differs from individual. And when we talk about Pitts versus Travis Kelce, as you put it, Eddie, Kelce to me is a top 5 tight end of all time, right? When I think of the greatest tight ends of all time, and I may be forgetting 1 or 2 names, but, in no particular order, Kellen Winslow Sr., Tony Gonzalez, Shannon Sharp, Travis Kelce, and Rob Gronkowski. All of those guys are, if not have been, should be, or will be first ballot Hall of Famers. And so when you say, like, we need to be having a conversation about Pitts and Kelce being on the same level, is that saying that we need to be having a conversation in the next year or two that Kyle Pitts is a definite lock to be a first ballot Hall of Famer? That to me is a ridiculous statement. No offense, Eddie. Now, you probably say, like, that's not what I mean. I just mean him being one of the best tight ends in the NFL. And it's like, okay, well, what is one of the best tight ends in the NFL? Is that being the number 1 tight end in the NFL, number 2 tight end in the NFL? Could that be number 6 tight end in the NFL, number 7 tight end in the NFL? And again, whether you're 6 or 7 or 1 or 2, a lot of that's not really in your control. Like, a lot of that's dependent on health of you as a player and the health of the rest of your team. Like, for example, Evan Ingram led all tight ends in the NFL last year in catches, right? And a big reason for that was, he played well last year, but also because he was basically the de facto number 2 wide receiver there behind Calvin Ridley. because Christian Kirk and Zay Jones, the Jaguars' number 2 and number 3 receivers, missed a significant chunk of the season. And so, like, I've seen various projections on Kyle Pitts and what production he'll have this year in 2024, and it's on par with a TE6 or a TE7 as opposed to a TE1 or TE2. And so, but if Drake London misses 5 games and Darnell Mooney misses 7 games this year, Kyle Pitts might move up in the rankings for that. And so that's going to help Kyle Pitts in terms of his numbers and be in the conversation for being the number 1 or number 2 tight end in the NFL, because he's putting up the production that merits that. But it's also going to hurt the Falcons' ability to win football games, which is part of the reason why I have a beef with fantasy football, because they only care about getting numbers rather than winning games. But that's just me. But, to me, ultimately, it doesn't really matter to me if Pitts and Kelsey are neck and neck in, your rankings. What matters to me is whether or not, when we get that opportunity in week 1 against the Steelers, can Kyle Pitts come down with the go-ahead score in that game? If the answer is yes, then, doesn't matter if he's worth the pick. He's helping us win football games. It's the same thing, the following week against the Eagles, right? I need him to make that critical grab on 3rd and 9, in the 4th quarter against the Eagles, and so on and so forth for the rest of the season. And that's part of the reason why I tend to not be as down on Kyle Pitts as other people, because I've seen him make those type of plays. He did it as a rookie in his 3rd NFL game against the Giants, right? We've seen other flashes of that ability. And unfortunately for him, injuries and circumstances have led to him not making as many of those plays as we would like him to make. But I see a player that's more than capable of, quote unquote, living up to the hype of the 4th round pick, at least based off of I see it. But, to me, it's ultimately arbitrary. It's like, okay, well, he has to be Travis Kelce to be worth the 4th round pick, or he can just be, better than, I don't know, Evan Ingram, right? And is that worth the pick? That's where the arbitrariness comes from. So I hope that explains, Eddie, where I'm coming from, where it's just like, to me, it's very arbitrary to base off of what a pick is worth, because, to a lot of folks, like in Kaleb McGary's case, he's a 1st round pick, even though a 31st overall pick has more in common with a mid-2nd round pick than he does of a mid-1st round pick in terms of most talent level of your typical late 1st round pick, right? Those are typically guys that are, quote unquote, 2nd round talent, more often than not. Even the ones that wind up being Hall of Famers like TJ Watt, right? And so, which is, you can be a 2nd round talent and be a Hall of Famer, right? So that's how that goes, because being a prospect is not being the player, right? We evaluate players, we evaluate prospects and we evaluate players, but just because you're a certain caliber of prospect, that's what determines where you get drafted. But that doesn't indicate what caliber of player you're going to wind up being. So I hope that makes it clear, Eddie, where I'm coming from on that. And, to each their own. But I just look at the player. And, at the end of the day, to me, the point of this is to watch your sports team win football games. And so, like, that's what I focus on, not whether or not I can look back at a draft pick 3 years ago or 7 years ago or 10 years ago and say, oh, we hit that draft. Like, who cares? Like, that's not going to win me any football games. My ability to block TJ Watt, my ability to come down with that, 3rd down catch in the 4th quarter is what is going to win me football games, not whether or not I can sit here and crow to my friends and say, hey, we've done a great job drafting over the years. Again, that's part of building a successful team, not to sit here and say it's meaningless. But again, like, ultimately, whether you live up to that pick, to me, is inconsequential to what I see the core issue being, which is winning football games. That's the whole point of this. That's the reason why you're watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, is you want to have a better understanding of why the Falcons win and or lose football games. Like, that's the whole point of Locked On Falcons, right? There are other podcasts that you can listen to that are much more entertaining, but there are very few podcasts that you're going to listen to that are going to give you the lowdown on what's going on with the football team and why they lost on a particular Sunday or why they won on a particular Sunday than Locked On Falcons. So, to each their own, but I hope that answers your question, Eddie. So we are not done here on the podcast. We got another question from Jeremy talking about whether or not Kaden Ellis would be better utilized as an outside linebacker in this defense. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So Jeremy asks, my other question is about Kaden Ellis. I know you've touched on him some. If Morris relies on simulated pressures and drops his edge guys a lot, why not move Ellis to outside linebacker to rush and drop into coverage? He could be in the mix with AK and Carter, etc. I'm guessing that only works if Troy takes a step forward and Lamb or JD. I think we could see Ellis dabble as an edge this year. I don't think it's really something that we'll see full time unless things go horribly wrong and the Falcons have a lot of injuries at edge. Good coaching to me is putting players in a position to succeed. And I don't think asking Kaden Ellis to move full-time to edge is putting him in a position to succeed, nor is it really putting other players in a position to see. More on that later. Because when Kaden Ellis is a good pass rusher, but he's most effective when he's going through A-gaps and going up against running backs rather than asking him to go up against offensive tackles, right? He's much more effective as a blitzing off-ball linebacker than he is as a full-time pass rusher. And so that's why I don't sit here and think you're putting him in a position to succeed if you try to make him into a full-time edge and ask him to basically beat Lane Johnson and, Broderick Jones and whoever else that he has to beat in order to be effective in that role. Now, I absolutely think the Falcons could dabble with Ellis as an edge or an outside linebacker in certain packages, especially if they use the penny front as part of their nickel defense. And for those of you that don't know, the penny front is when you use a 5-1 front on nickel, which is 3 down D linemen, 2 outside linebackers, and 1 inside linebacker, which is, different from the traditional front that a 3-4 team like the Falcons are going to use in the nickel, which is a 2-4 front, which is 2 down linemen, 2 outside linebackers, and 2 inside linebackers, right? 2 outside linebackers and 2 inside linebackers. I hope I said that correctly. So the Brandon Staley derivative defenses like Raheem Morris in LA and Ejiro Evero in Denver and Carolina have been use a lot of penny fronts, right? And so I can imagine a scenario where Troy Anderson is your inside linebacker in that situation, Ellis and or Arnold Ebiketie are your outside linebackers, Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata are 2 out of your 3 defensive linemen, and the other one is to be determined, probably Zach Harrison or Ruka Roro, but we'll see on that front. And so the idea of when you want to utilize the penny front, as I understand it, again, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I tried my best, is it's a way to, when you're in nickel with 5 defensive backs, it's going to be more effective, especially against teams that like to run outside the tackles, particularly outside zone rushing teams. And so I think that's a useful tool in your toolbox in certain matchups when you face teams that are going to play, you're going to run outside zone out of 11 personnel, which is when you're going to play nickel. But I don't think that's a way that you're going to live every single week and certainly not every single down. Now, we also may see instances this upcoming season where Ellis moves to outside linebacker and the Falcons have Nate Landman and Troy Anderson at inside linebacker. But again, I think that's only going to use in your base defense against heavy personnel groupings against offense. So teams that are going to deploy a lot of 2 tight ends, put a fullback on the field, those types of offenses in certain situations. And in that situation, Ellis, that is, would be replacing Arnold Ebiketie as the outside linebacker rather than Lorenzo Carter, just because Lorenzo Carter is going to be a little bit more of a force player as a run defender, setting the edge and doing all those things. And that's something that at this point in time, Arnold Ebiketie has not proven he can be consistent at doing. He has not proven up to this day. And that's another area that we're looking to see if he can improve upon. But, ultimately, I don't think this is going to be a huge part of your defense. Like, I would guess that Kaden Ellis playing edge in these penny fronts and whatever we're going to call this heavy 3 linebacker set, probably going to only amount to maybe like 10% of your defensive plays, probably no more than that. Again, barring, if you're Braylon Trice and Lorenzo Carter and Arnold Ebiketie all get hurt and you're like, well, Kaden Ellis is now our best option at outside linebacker, then maybe that situation. But assuming that you're not devastated by injuries, I would imagine Kaden Ellis is going to spend the vast majority of his snaps playing off-ball linebacker. And a big part of that is because I'm assuming that Kaden Ellis is going to continue to wear the green dot for this defense. Now, maybe he doesn't, but if he's not going to wear the green dot, who is? Maybe that's Jesse Bates. Some teams do put a safety there. I know Derwin James has worn the green dot for the Chargers in the past. I know the Ravens have dabbled with maybe Kyle Hamilton his rookie year and Chuck Clark wearing the green dot in the past. So some teams do have a safety wear the green dot. And for those of you that don't know what the green dot is, it is the player that has the communication device in their helmet, and only one player on defense is allowed to have it. And it's almost universally one of your inside linebackers. So that's why I sit here and I go like, I've never heard of a team asking an edge rusher to wear the green dot. I've never heard of that. I've seen teams do that for an inside linebacker, a Mike linebacker, a Will linebacker, or a safety, but I've never seen it for an edge rusher. So if you're going to remove the green dot from Kaden Ellis by making him an edge, who's going to wear it? Is it Troy Anderson? That would be presumably the person I would expect to do it. But do you really want Troy Anderson calling the defense in basically his first year as a starter? He's played like 8 games in the NFL, basically, so it's like, I don't know if we're going that. And then Nate Landman, okay, like, right, Nate Landman has more experience, but do you want Nate Landman to be a full-time player? Because like you kind of need the guy to wear the green dot to be on the field every single snap, and I don't think you want Nate Landman as a full-time player. And we've talked about this before, where Nate Landman is limited in coverage, right? The Falcons defense, last year they loved on their third downs, they loved to play dime defense with 6 defensive backs. And we talked quite a bit throughout the season about, their usage of Ruby dime defense or their traditional dime front, right? And the traditional dime front is you have 4 down D linemen and 1 inside linebacker, 4-1. A Ruby dime defense is a 3-2, where you have 3 down D linemen and 2 inside linebackers. And basically in week 3 against the Lions, the Falcons started playing a lot of Ruby dime defense, and then Troy Anderson got hurt in that game. And then outside of like maybe 4, maybe 5 games, they basically scrapped their Ruby dime defense for the rest of the season, because the coaching staff, as we say, put players in a position to succeed. And that's what good coaching is. Or, put another way, not putting players in a position to fail. The Falcons deemed that Nate Landman was not a good enough coverage linebacker, so they basically were pulling him off the field for most of the season on every third down. And so asking a player to call your defense that is not good enough to play on every single snap is probably not a good strategy. Now, I'm sure plenty of you were like, well, that was the old coaching staff and the new coaching staff is going to be different. It's like, okay, if you think just changing coaches means that a player is going to run faster than a 4.8 640, okay, like if that's what you think. But like, I don't think there's any reason for anybody to think that Nate Landman is going to be a more effective coverage player than he was under the previous regime, right? Nate Landman is very good at one thing. He's very good as a downhill run defender in between the tackles. And that affects like 10 to 12 plays a game on average in NFL play, where teams run between the tackles out of 63 some odd plays in an NFL game. But for the other 50 or so plays, like Nate Landman is not a plus defender. He's more of a minus in that regard. And again, I don't mean that to be like Nate Landman's terrible. I just sit here and I go like, that's not a player that I think should be a full-time player. And so when I see people being like, he should start over Troy Anderson, or he should, be on the field as much as possible, and we should move Kaden Ellis to edge so that we can get Nate Landman on the field. I'm just like, I don't think you guys were paying any attention to the defense last year, which, again, this is why I'm here. I'm watching the film, so you don't have to. But, Nate Landman's a good player, but he's limited. It's basically the point I'm trying to make. And so to me, all that to say, I think asking Kaden Ellis to move to a different position is not putting him in a position to succeed. And I don't think it's putting other players like a Nate Landman or like a Troy Anderson in positions to succeed, because you're going to have to reshuffle things. So I expect to see a lot of Kaden Ellis as still at that linebacker position, but the Falcons could, of course, dabble in certain packages in certain situations as a way to match up with certain teams in certain formations with Kaden Ellis as an edge. But I don't think that's something that anybody should be expecting as a full-time or something that they can do, again, outside of maybe 5 to 10% of their plays, because it's just a sub package of their defense. So we'll see on that front. I hope that answers your question, Jeremy. Appreciate Eddie and Jeremy for the great questions. I know there are other insiders that ask questions. We might get to those in the coming days. I know I want to get to my Jace McClellan breakdown by the end of this week, so hopefully that will be the Friday episode. And then so that leaves tomorrow open for potentially another Q&A and other topics. I know we're inching towards training camp, and so I do want to get into some of the positional breakdowns, but we're going to do it a little differently this year. So that is something that is in store for you possibly tomorrow. So make sure you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. For your second listen, of course, check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.